Hello everybody. It's amazing to think that this time last week I dropped a video about the recent Hasbro PulseCon reveals, and one of those reveals was the Spider-Man animated series Vulture set. And here we are just a week later and it's actually in my hands. In fact, they got this to me within 2 or 3 days, which is quite incredible. If only this was the experience all toy companies provided for their customers. I am so tired of pre-orders and waiting 18 months very often to get my hands on figures that I've ordered. It's amazing to think that this was only announced last Friday and it was in my hands by the Wednesday. That is incredible service, and I hope this is a model that toy companies move towards in the future, because this is excellent service. So with that said, let's take a look at this packaging. Now, it is the VHS style packaging we've come to know and love from the Spider-Man animated series line, which seems to be going very, very strong. This is the 3rd set we've had this year, which is really encouraging. That means hopefully we're going to get a few more next year as well. And they've adopted the standard Toy Biz style branding and design that we used to get on the 90s packaging of our 5-inch scale figures, which is absolutely fantastic. That really hits the nostalgic sweet spot for me, and this looks absolutely brilliant. This is newly commissioned artwork, but it's very much in their keeping and the style of the 90s animated series show. It looks like it's just been lifted directly from that show, which is absolutely fantastic. Of course, we've got the city skyscape in the background, but having these two fantastic images here, Spider-Man versus the Vulture fighting, looks absolutely brilliant when you put this on display. And I'm really pleased that we finally have a pairing on these sets that makes sense. So often they're quite random, but this works perfectly well. And if we look at the side panels, we can see on one side we have the VHS style packaging there, and we have Spider-Man facing off against the Vulture. This looks pretty cool, and again, pretty consistent with what we've had in the set so far. And we can even put these alongside some of those X-Men animated series figures we had as well, so they can look pretty consistent in your collection, and it looks pretty fun. But on the other side, we have those billboards again with Spidey versus the Vulture and the Spider-Man animated series logo. So it's entirely up to you how you display these, but you've got a couple of options there, and I think that's really nice that that's been thought out, which is pretty fun. And then on the reverse of the packaging, we have, again, very much in the keeping of the Toy Biz years, these images here, actual photographs of the action figures, again, in that billboard style, with the same design they had all those years ago behind them. I still think this looks great, even today, all these years later, but maybe I'm biased since I did grow up with these. So the first half of the packaging is dedicated to that, which looks great. Then there's an awful lot of small print there, which is, slightly distracting. So this probably isn't the side you're going to want to put on display in all truth, but nevertheless, it's still quite nicely presented. Okay, so let's start off by taking a look at the Spider-Man. Now, this is certainly not the first Spider-Man we've had in the Marvel Legends line, not by a long shot, and it's not even the first animated series Spider-Man we've had. Marvel Legends fans will no doubt remember the cel-shaded animated series Spidey, which came single-carded. This was quite difficult to track down at the time. I managed to get my hands on one eventually, but it was a good long while after it was released, and I got it on the secondary market, and it was quite a nice figure, but this is a very different head sculpt to what we have on this latest release. Although I do want to draw your attention to the fact that this Spider-Man had a very thin, a very narrow red banded waist. That's interesting, especially when we compare it against the other Spider-Man animated series retro card, single carded release that we had of Spidey, who had a much thicker waistband there of the red webbing, which is kind of interesting. Once again, a very different head sculpt. In fact, he had 2 head sculpts, but both very different to the one we have on this latest release. Now, I don't think this latest release is actually a new sculpt. I feel like we've had this before on other Spider-Men, so I don't think this is brand new by any stretch of the imagination, but it is definitely different to the previous animated series retro-carded Spideys. Phew. And if we take a look at the body sculpt for this version of Spider-Man, we'll see they've used a slightly different version. This is what I tend to think of as the Human Torch body sculpt, but I think it was used long before we had that recent Human Torch figure, and it's been used many, many times since. But essentially, this is a sort of mid-build body that has the butterfly wing joint at the top of the torso there. Now, you can see that once again, they've opted for a very narrow, in fact, I think this is the narrowest version yet, of the sort of red band in the centre of the torso. I don't mind this, it's definitely distinctive and a bit different to what we've had previously, although we did see it on that cel-shaded version, but I'm not sure why they're sticking with this, since in the animated series it's not particularly thin, it's pretty broad actually, so I'm not sure why they've alighted on this for the animated series Spideys, but hey, I just thought I'd mention it. The other thing worth noting is the richness of the colours on this figure. So there's very little in the way of paint apps apart from the painted on spiderweb effect. They are just using the base plastic moulds, but we actually have a fairly deep navy, almost navy blue for the blue, and a very dark vivid red, which I think actually works pretty well. I actually think this is probably a little bit more accurate to the animated series than we got with the cel shaded version, which was a bit more of a powder blue, a little bit brighter. Obviously it had the cel shading. This figure has no cel shading, which I think will probably please some people and maybe not others, but all in all I think this is very vivid and very attractive, and I think they've got the colours really nicely spot on actually. And the dimensions of the spider logos are really nicely done. Again, I think they've done a pretty solid job with these. The only thing I did want to point out is that sadly the one on the back is a little bit compromised by the peg hole, which does, it is a bit distracting. It does take the eye away a little bit from the overall look of this figure, which is a shame. Now, it's one of those, I think a lot of people will be very pleased to have this so they can put him in all sorts of leaping poses, for example, but for me, yeah, I'd probably rather not have it because it's just too distracting. Otherwise, I don't think there's anything new or particularly noteworthy about the body on this figure. We've seen this many times before. Pretty standard when it comes to articulation, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But yeah, all the proportions seem to be pretty accurate. He stands freely. Sadly, no toe articulation, which is a shame. But otherwise, this is a very nicely presented figure and looks pretty good. So then, looking at the articulation, he does have the ball joint at the top of the neck there, allowing the head to spin all the way around and kind of wobble left and right, but I wouldn't say it's really posable in this sense. He does have a hinge there in the neck as well, so he can look up and down a really good distance, which is great. He does have that wonderful aforementioned butterfly wing joint that I love so much, so of course he also has complementary ball joints there in the shoulders. The arms will lift up and out, they'll go in and out. There is the bicep swivel, double joint at the elbow, and the standard pin swivel at the wrist there, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around, and hinge of course forwards and backwards. There is a straight swivel at the waist, allowing the figure to move from side to side, and we have an ab crunch in the centre of the chest there, allowing the figure to bend forwards and backwards. Now, it's not a huge range of motion. I had assumed we'd get a little bit more out of this than we actually get, which is a bit surprising, but hey, it's still pretty decent. We've got ball joints in the hips, of course, so the legs will kick out to the side. There is a thigh swivel at the top there, and there's another swivel at the top of the boot cut as well. The legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, there's a double joint at the knee, allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back, and then we have an ankle rocker as well, allowing that foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also rock from side to side. In terms of accessories, Spidey comes with a few little goodies, including 2 additional pairs of hands, some closed fists and some gripping hands. He comes with the removed mask effect, which is kind of cool, but very, very flat. And then we actually get not 1 but 2 alternate heads, a Peter Parker head, and most surprisingly, a Flash Thompson head. So making his debut, I think, in the Marvel Legends line full stop, and certainly in the animated series line. This is kind of unusual. Now, in terms of the Peter Parker head, I'm pretty sure this is the same head sculpt we got on the previous Peter Parker release not too long ago. So I think they've just recycled this. But if you didn't get that one, here's your chance to have an unmasked Spidey, which I have to say doesn't look quite right. The proportions look ever so slightly off here, like the head just looks a little bit too small compared to the neck that we see and the rest of the body. Maybe I just haven't got mine fitted properly, but this doesn't look quite right. If we take a look at the Flash Thompson head, I think it's actually a pretty decent sculpt. It definitely captures the character. I actually reckon there's a little bit more detail in this sculpt than there is in the animated series. This features a lot flatter in the animated series, where there's actually a bit more depth to this version and more detailing in the lines in the face there. Obviously, this is a very scowling expression, which is perfectly appropriate for this character. I think they've done a pretty good job. I think they've caught the likeness well, for the most part. I think it's definitely recognisable, and there's some nice paint apps actually going on the face there to add a little bit of colour to the cheeks, etc. I'm not sure whether the hair is actually combed the right way. If we look at this still here, And once again, it just looks ever so slightly off to me. But nevertheless, I am pleased to have Flash Thompson head sculpt. I would actually be quite happy to have a figure if they decide to put him in another 2-pack in the future. But here, it's a nice, fun little extra. I'm not going to judge too harshly because this wasn't something I was really expecting. So I think, they've done a pretty decent job. For the point of comparison, I thought it would be interesting to put the latest version of Spidey on the left next to the cell shaded version of Spidey on the right to see how they contrast. And you can see obviously very big differences in the colour there, but also the scaling is slightly different. This version of Spidey is slightly taller, which is kind of interesting, and I wasn't really expecting that. He's got almost half an inch on that cell shaded version, which is interesting and a bit odd. So then, all in all, for me, I'm really happy to give this figure 4 stars. I think it's a really serviceable, very strong Spider-Man figure. Is it specific from the animated series? Well, I think that's debatable, you could argue that, but I do think there's things that are definitely specific to this version of the character. They clearly are trying to differentiate it with that narrow band in the waist there. The articulation is pretty solid. It's one of my favourite molds they've used in terms of that. It's a shame that we don't have the ball joint in the top of the torso area. We've seen that used on a lot of other Spider-Man figures to great success recently, and it works really well. It's a real shame that we don't have that here. I would have really liked to have seen that. Likewise, I think toe articulation on a Spider-Man figure works really well. Again, disappointing that we don't have that. But that being said, you can do pretty much everything you want to do with this figure, and I think, it's a pretty serviceable figure. It looks really good. It looks very presentable. I really like the colours they've used on it as well, and I think, they've done their best to try and really make this, different to other Spideys, which is, appreciated. They haven't just recycled a recent release, which is great. And I also think they've gone to the extra effort there of actually throwing in a couple of fun extras in terms of the alternate heads, and giving us the Flash Thompson head in particular is obviously something that is brand new and special to this release. Okay, so let's move on to the Vulture. Now, the Vulture is actually one of my all-time favourite villains in the animated series. I love this story. Sadly, it only makes the one appearance across 2 episodes, I believe. But it was such a good story, and I really love this particular costume, which actually was moderated, taken from the Bagley run on the comics at the time. Anyway, I digress. Long overdue is the point I'm trying to make, and I think they've done a pretty nice job with the presentation of the figure. If we start by taking a look at this head sculpt, I think it's fair to say they've caught the likeness pretty much spot on by my reckoning. This is really, really good. I like the headband in particular. I like the materials they've used, both on that and actually on his various armor pieces on the costume. They've used a very metallic looking, very light reflective green, which works really well because it catches the light. It looks slightly metallic. It looks really, really nicely done. I think the expression on the face is perfect. I think there's a hint of malice there, but also a smugness, a slyness, I think, which works really well for this character. And it's nicely painted, nicely proportioned, and the hair quiff, it all looks pretty good. The only quibble I would have there is that sadly there's no shading running through the hair, and I think it really needs it just to give it a little bit more of that. I hesitate to use the word realism because obviously it's based on the animated series, but a little bit more depth. I think will just make it look more realistic, quote unquote. Really love the body mold they've used for this figure. I think we've seen this many times before in terms of the base body mold. I think we've had this on Captain America figures, for example. So I don't think there's anything particularly new about that. But the armor pieces are really nice, and they're all placed on top and sculpted around it, which looks fantastic. As I said, I really love the contrast in the green. So we've got the metallic green, but we also have the more base flat sort of light green as well in between, linking that, which creates this really nice two-tone effect, which just really enhances the figure. And then we have the much darker green of the body, and it all just works in terms of the colours. I think it's a really great design. It looks fantastic on display, and there's no doubt about it, the presentation of this figure is pretty fantastic. Now, what we also have is things like the utility belt, which is sculpted in. We have the sort of yellow pellets there as well, which look pretty cool. And then you'll notice he has this gun holster, and we look a little bit closer at that. This is moulded in and just painted, sadly, and this lets it down a little bit, because actually even the Toy Biz figure from the 1990s in the 5-inch scale had this as a removable piece. He could actually take his weapon out and use it. Sadly, he can't do that, and that seems like a huge oversight for Marvel Legends, who pride themselves on the functionality and detailing, and this seems a little bit of corner cutting, I suppose, which is disappointing, because I would really like to be able to remove that and actually have him hold it. I think that'd be ace. Otherwise, in terms of the legs, etc., there's nothing really new here, and there's no shading on this figure at all to really draw out any of the detailing. This seems to be pretty standard for Marvel Legends these days, sadly, so I probably shouldn't quibble. But it is nice he's got the pellets sculpted into his leg there. I think that works really well. In terms of the wings, we've seen these before. These are actually two separate pieces for each wing. You can actually slide these into his gauntlets on his wrist, and then also on the back of his bicep as well. And this hooks into place. And for the most part, actually, it's pretty secure and works well. And it does create a pretty strong, a very broad wingspan, which is great, but I find it a little bit frustrating, to be honest, because it does really hamper the posability, as we'll see a little bit later, although they have tried to think that through by actually splitting each wing into two parts, so credit to them for doing that, and we've seen it work successfully on other figures in the past, like Falcons, etc., but it does also mean that the figure tends to be a little bit top heavy and will lean forwards, and there's no display stand with this figure to keep him on his feet, so you're always going to want to make sure that you're resting him next to a surface like a wall or something to keep him standing, and you're probably just going to find your own display stand really. But yeah, just something to point out. It looks great, don't get me wrong. I think it's all about presentation, this figure, but in terms of functionality, it's a little bit underwhelming there. Articulation wise, he has the ball joint at the top of the neck there, so the head will rotate all the way around and it will wobble left and right, but again, not really posable in that sense. He will look down through that joint there, which is good, but he cannot really look back because of the hairpiece, which is unfortunate. Now, he does have ball joints in the top of the shoulders there, but that shoulder pad is really restrictive, and surprisingly so, because Marvel Legends are usually very good at working around this, and yeah, sadly, you're not going to get a lot of maneuverability out of this. Now, he does have the bicep swivel, the double joint at the elbow there, although persevere if you've got the wings in place, because that's a bit challenging, and then he has the standard pin swivel at the wrist, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around, and of course, hinge forwards and backwards. Again, he's got a straight swivel at the waist, allowing him to move from side to side, and he's got the same ab crunch as the Spidey there, allowing him to bend forwards and backwards. But again, not a huge range of motion. He definitely goes back further than he does forwards. Ball joints in the hips, the legs will kick out to the side, there's the thigh swivel at the top of the leg there, the legs kick forwards, they kick backwards, and there's a double joint at the knee allowing the lower leg to kick all the way back, and of course we have that ankle rocker here again, so of course the foot can hinge forwards and backwards, but also pivot from side to side. Sadly, the Vulture is a little bit lighter when it comes to accessories. He comes with an alternate pair of closed fists and this alternate Adrian Toomes head, or the old Vulture head, which, to be fair, it looks absolutely fantastic, and I'm really pleased they included it. I think that's absolutely fantastic. Is there anything else I would have expected? Well, not too much, but again, that blaster, that gun that he has, that would have been very cool. Let's take a closer look at the old Vulture head. I think this works really, really well. There's an awful lot of detail, a lot of sculpting in the face there, really etching in those lines and grooves on his face, which, really give that effect. It looks great. I think that, there's some nice paint apps here as well to draw that out. And I think this looks absolutely fantastic. I mean, spot on. And actually, gives it a little bit more detail than we see in the animated series, I think. But this is great. I think this looks really, really good. And for me, that's what this figure is all about. It's all about presentation, because I think it looks fantastic. I think it's actually quite limited as a figure in terms of what you can do with it, hence why I'm going to give it 4 stars. Now, this could have been a 5-star figure if they'd give him that blaster, if he was slightly more posable, if they thought through the balancing with the wings, given us a display stand or something like that to help with that, if they thought through the articulation in the shoulders. There's just a few different things that I think we needed to make this a 5-star figure, but there's no denying that this looks absolutely brilliant. Like, he's one of the standout ones in this animated series line we've had of Spidey figures, and I love this line. I think it's, every release is very, very strong so far, and this is, one of the strongest figures, and for me, one of my favourite villains, and I think he looks brilliant. It's just when you try to do anything with him, that suddenly it becomes a little bit disappointing and a bit frustrating to deal with. He's very limited in terms of the poses I've been able to get him into, and yeah, getting him to display properly, yeah, definitely a challenge. But he does look cool, there's no denying it, and I think this looks brilliant. And there you have it. There's my thoughts on the Spider-Man Vulture animated series set. As ever, do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm always curious to know how other people have found these sets and whether they're interested in buying them or not. For me, I love this line, and I think this is another solid entry in what is a very fun line so far. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out, and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.